Good evening and welcome. I'm Susanna Chu, member of the East Brunswick Human Relations Council. Tonight's event is brought to you by the Human Relations Council and the East Brunswick Public Library, entitled Building Bridges, Combating Anti-Asian Racism. Over the past year, the East Brunswick Human Relations Council has featured many stories of hope and optimism about how community members have come together to support each other during difficult times. At the same time, we also tackled tough issues like bias, racism, and civil discourse. We dedicated our 2018 Unity Walk event to stand in solidarity with the Jewish community in the wake of the shooting in Pittsburgh. We held a discussion with Mayor Cohen and our police chief to address questions about police practices in the wake of the tragic murder of George Floyd. As stated by Dr. Chan-Malik during a panel discussion back in November about civil discourse, part of the problem we face is polarization, which can happen when information is gained myopically. One of our goals for tonight's event is to expand our collective views to help us understand the rise of anti-Asian racism. This is not a new issue, but we've seen a rise in hate crimes targeting Asians by 50%. While my family across the world, across the US, Canada, China, Hong Kong, we've been talking about this regularly over the past year. This hasn't necessarily been in the headlines until the shooting in Atlanta where 6 Asian women were killed because someone was, quote unquote, having a bad day. Again, to quote Dr. Chan-Malik from our civil discourse event, we hope to have a productive, generative discussion that leads to outcomes. The theme of tonight's discussion is building bridges to broaden the understanding of the concerns of the Asian American community that will lead to stronger bonds across all members of our community to reject bias and racism of any form. Now I'll turn it over to Mayor Brad Cohen for some brief opening remarks.
Thank you, Susanna. And we go back a long way, even from before our work together on the Board of Education here in the township. And I absolutely want to thank you for your contribution to this event tonight and all of the events that you and your fellow members of the Human Relations Council have been able to provide during what we are in the middle of right now, which are turbulent times. Hate groups are on the rise, white supremacy is on the rise, and I don't think it goes unnoticed that tonight's discussion falls on the heels of the decision that was just rendered in the George Floyd case. Maybe we can look at that as the beginning of some hope in this country, that we are, as Americans, our Constitution says we the people. We elect people from the will of the people. We are a representative government. And when a jury makes a decision, they represent the people. And maybe we can celebrate tonight that the people have spoken, and maybe some of this is starting to seep into the American psyche. And hopefully this is the beginning of some change, because it's the beginning. It's certainly not the end. We have seen the rise of these type of incidences, and tonight's discussion is specifically around and centered on the rise in anti-Asian hate crime. But hate groups advocate extreme prejudice, vandalism, violence. They try to instill fear and terror based on somebody's race, religion, creed, ethnic background, gender. And they tap into a underlying bigotry that clearly exists in this country. And we can't let that win. And hopefully tonight is the beginning of fighting back and proving that this isn't what defines Americans. Groups have studied what to do, and in terms of how to address communities, all the way back 30, 40, 50 years, the first guides to responding to hate groups that I can recall came out of Olympia, Washington, an area that is known for a lot of its progressive thoughts. And there's a couple of themes that they believe we as communities need to be doing. And if we're going to address the issues we're about to tackle tonight, and this is something that the Human Relations Council has been doing for years now. This is why I believe our community is exceptional. But what do? First, you have to get your facts right. You have to be dead on about the facts. We need to be able to have all of that at our disposal so that we're all talking about the same thing. We're not talking a different language. We have to support those who have been targets of hate. Tonight, we're going to be discussing anti-Asian crime, but there's been anti-Muslim, there's been anti-Semitic, there has been obviously a long history of racism against our fellow citizens of color, disabilities. This is not new. We have to show our support for each other. We have to map out who our allies are and make sure that we share our concerns and stick up for one another. We have to host meetings and such as the ones we're having tonight and get this discussion out. And then we need to develop a community-based response, which is what our Human Relations Council is doing, whether that and what we are doing as a township and a community, whether it's rallies, guest speakers such as tonight who are experts in these areas. Critical is to engage the schools. The children are where we need to start in terms of education. They get their biggest education at home. And if they're getting the wrong education at home, it becomes incumbent upon the rest of the community to try to correct those mistakes early on. We have to do marketing campaigns and ads and celebrate our successes. Tonight's verdict was a success, but it's not the end. And so I applaud everybody that's here tonight. I know you're all experts. I know you've got a lot to say, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say. We just need to remember that, and I think it's kind of summed up in a poem that was written by Martin Niemöller back in around the 1930s. He was a German priest who was initially a supporter of Nazism, but eventually became one of its staunch people fighting against it. And he said, first, they came for the socialists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a socialist. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. And then they came out for the Jews, and I didn't speak out because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. So tonight we need to speak out for our friends in the Asian community who have been suffering and being the targets of hate. But there's a big message here, and I'm hoping that we can come to some conclusion and reach out to those who aren't on the call tonight, because that's the people who we really need to reach. And again, I want to thank everybody for their involvement. I also wanted to introduce everyone to our Assemblyman for District, Sterling Stanley, who was able, and thank him for jumping on to this call tonight.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to say I'm very proud of East Brunswick and the East Brunswick Human Relations Council. I see the stride that you have made in the last few years to bring about the community harmony and working within the community and within our police department, and all the achievements you have done in the last 1 year, and I congratulate you all on that. Like the mayor said, tonight, we're seeing a verdict, of justice being served. I remember back in 1992, witnessing firsthand the riots that took place in Los Angeles and the aftermath, and also the verdicts that were handed down. So we can see what a great difference it is. And we can also see that there has been change, but there's a lot more change that needs to be done. From a legislative standpoint, there is a lot that we can do, and we are working with a lot of different groups talking about anti-racism, the racial injustice and inequality that's happening. And we are working to see how best we can bring about some changes by introducing new bills. On the federal level, there's already several introductions in the Senate. Hopefully they will all pass. And we just have to work harder, I feel. It is incumbent upon us to take the mantle to actually dismantle the hatred. We can do all the legislations we want and put across so many laws and bills to actually punish the perpetrators, but we can't legislate the hate out of someone's heart. That can only be done one person at a time through efforts like this tonight, coming across, talking together, showing our differences, embracing our differences, and being able to understand each other one by one. And it's very important that we take these steps. And I see that a lot of these steps have been taken in the last 1 year, and more groups have reached out. One of the things that I have noticed in the last 2 months that I've been in office is that we do get a lot more requests to have conversations with groups regarding the racial inequality, regarding injustice, regarding a lot of different things that are going on within New Jersey and outside of New Jersey, and how we can combat that. And I just want to let you know that I'm here for you all. Whatever you need, my office is there. Please contact us. We're more than happy to sit down with you and talk any ideas that you might have as far as legislatively we can bring forth. And I'll be more than happy to work with you. I'm also very interested in listening to dialogues tonight. I will be on for a little while, but I will be actually going to another vigil soon. At 8:30, they're holding for the George Floyd verdict. So once again, I want to thank you all for the time and effort that you're putting into this. And I also want to commend you all once again for the togetherness that we show. East Brunswick has been known and is known to be so culturally diverse. We have such a smorgasbord of people from all over the world living within our community here. And it's great pride and pleasure that we have such a great diverse group of residents in East Brunswick, and we should embrace everyone. And that's one of the mandates we should have, to embrace our differences, to learn about our cultures, and to appreciate one another more and more. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mayor Cullen and Assemblyman Stanley. It is now my pleasure to get into the program. I'd like to introduce Dr. Sylvia Chan-Malik, who is an associate professor in the departments of American Studies and Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University-New Brunswick. She teaches and writes about the intersections of race, gender, and religion, with a focus on the history and cultures of Islam and the Muslims in the United States. She is the author of Being Muslim, A Cultural History of Women of Color in American Islam. She speaks frequently on issues of US Muslim politics and culture, Islam and gender, and racial and gender politics in the US. Her commentary has appeared in venues such as NPR, Slate News, Huffington Post, and many others. So welcome, Dr. Chan-Malik, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Susanna. And I just want to thank everyone, Mayor Cohen, Mr. Stanley, for joining us tonight, and also our esteemed guest, who I will introduce in a moment. And so going off the comments that have been made before me, I want to acknowledge that earlier this evening, as we all know, Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin was found guilty by a jury of his peers of all the charges against him in the murder of George Floyd: second degree unintentional murder, third degree murder, and second degree manslaughter. And I think this is significant to this night, to this evening's events, because it speaks to and highlights many of the issues we are addressing in our conversation tonight about anti-Asian violence, race and racism, and their relationship to US politics, our ideas about citizenship, and our legal system. In particular, the guilty verdict, and in some cases, the elation, the relief, the joy many are feeling over it, are due to the very topic we are discussing this evening, which is that of racialized violence in this country. And racialized violence is violence that is continually, not just in singular instances, but continually directed at a community due to their race and due to perceptions that others hold about a community due to their racial or ethnic identity. In this way, violence is perpetuated not just through individual acts. They are not just exceptional instances or the acts of lone actors, but they occur in repeated and systematic ways in different places and different times in history. In the case of the Asian American community in the United States, racialized violence has taken many forms. And in recent months, many of us have seen horrific videos, as Susanna said, of elderly Asian men and women being attacked, mobbed, assaulted in the street. We've heard of racial biases in which Asian Americans have been told to go back to their country, and they've been called carriers of the China virus. They've been spit on, taunted, mocked. At the same time, we understand that Asians are often called the model minority. And with that goes these perceptions of Asian Americans as docile, nerdy, submissive, robotic, unfeeling, and or always foreign, never quite American. And so, I always say to my crew who understands, when people say to you, but where are you really from? I'm born and raised in the United States, from California, but everybody knows what I mean when I say that if you're in that crew. Okay, so understanding the origins of these types of stereotypes and the types of violence they have fueled is far beyond the scope of our conversation tonight. But I would strongly encourage, as a follow-up to tonight's conversation, for everyone here to look into these histories. So I just want to close by saying, that sometimes it's hard to seek out these stories. And as a professor, and Khyati can probably, Dr. Joshi can also attest to this as well, as someone who teaches these histories in the classroom, you will encounter students year after year who are utterly shocked at the history of violence that's been directed at Asians in this country. They have never heard of the Chinese massacre of 1871 in Los Angeles, where 19 Chinese immigrants were shot or lynched or hung to death by an angry white mob. They don't know that the first Exclusion Act in this country was not in 1882, but in 1875, with a law called the Page Act that barred Asian women from entry because of their barbarism and sexual deviance. They've never heard of the murder of Vincent Chin in Detroit in 1982, in which a Chinese American, the week before his wedding, was brutally murdered by two white men, Ronald Evans and Michael Nitz, where witnesses testified they screamed racial slurs at Chin while they beat him to death. They never spent a day in jail and were only ordered to pay $3,000 and serve 3 years probation. There are so many more instances like this directed at Asian communities, and we cannot understand what is happening now without understanding the past and the cycles in which this violence occurs. These incidents that are happening now are not exceptions or aberrations, but they are just the latest iteration of anti-Asian sentiment in this country. I don't think you'll encounter many of us here, Asian Americans, who don't have a litany of stories about personal how they've been shown in subtle and not so subtle ways that they do not belong. And I want to connect some of those stories and those feelings that we experience on an individual level to the larger spate of anti-Asian crime. So I know our panelists will give us wonderful insights into their really important work in their communities and their research in thinking about this way. And I do hope our conversation in some small way prevents, future instances of violence by intervening upon the types of logics and systems that perpetuate these events over and over again. So let me first introduce our two wonderful panelists this evening. First, we have Dr. Kiati Joshi, who is a public intellectual whose social science research and community connections inform policymakers, educators, and everyday people about race, religion, and immigration in 21st century America. She's lectured around the world and published groundbreaking scholarly and popular work in her field, while also serving as an advisor to policymakers and a leader in the South Asian American community. Her most recent book is a really wonderful book, I might add, White Christian Privilege, The Illusion of Religious Equality equality in America. In addition, she's a professor of education at Farley Dickinson University and a social science researcher whose work focuses on the intersections of race and religion in the United States. She frequently consults with school districts, independent schools, the judiciary, nonprofit organizations, faith communities, and business on fostering equity and inclusion. And she's just a really lovely person to boot. So thank you, Khyati, for being here with us. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Pastor Thomas Wong. Thomas Wong received his Master's of Divinity from Trinity International University in 2001. Since then, he has pastored at Rutgers Community Church from 2001 to 2007, and is currently the senior pastor at Point Community Church, a multi-ethnic and multicultural congregation here in East Brunswick. As part of the Southern Baptist denomination, he has served on the coaching team and assistant team for new pastors and planters in the New Jersey, New York area, as well as president of the Asian American Fellowship. He is currently a member of the East Brunswick Interfaith Council, as well as the East Brunswick Alliance for the Prevention of Alcoholism and Drug Abuse. And I am so excited to speak to my panelists, and we don't have that much time. So I wanted to start off with some questions to each of you individually, and then I'm hoping we can take on some larger questions together. And I wanted to start with Khyati, who is the founder of a really wonderful organization called Jersey Promise, whose mission states that it wants to tell the story of who we are as Asian Americans here in New Jersey. So first of all, to give us some grounding, tell us, who are Asian Americans in New Jersey? And what does advocating for the Asian American community in New Jersey look like? What are the issues? What are the specificities? And what should we know about this community that is all around us here in New Jersey?
Lots of questions there.
Sorry, okay, what's Jersey Promise?
Yeah,
Who's
yeah.
the Asian American community?
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here, and it's wonderful, particularly being on with a fellow Asian American Studies scholar with Sylvia. And well, let me say that I'm one of the co-founders, along with Jun Choi, former mayor of Edison. And we had been talking about doing this for some time, and finally, pulled some people together, the other authors of the report, myself, Manisha Kalkar, Jun Choi, Professor Ron Chen at Rutgers Law School in Newark, and Richard Sun, who works for the Department of Transportation now. And we took on topics because we saw this need, right? Asian Americans, as of the 2010 census, were about 10.4% of the state. Projections show that we will comprise almost 15% of the state when we get our 2020 census numbers. Asian Americans don't often realize they're Asian Americans, right? So we are talking about everyone who traces their ancestry back from parts of, Central Western Asia, starting, we could say with, some people include Afghanistan in South Asia, and some people don't, going from Pakistan over into India, into Southeast Asia. Then it includes folks who trace their ancestry from East Asia, Korea, Japan, China. Then we're talking about the Filipinos, also, and Pacific Islanders. Sometimes Filipinos are Asian, sometimes they consider themselves Pacific Islanders, right? And what's really important to understand, when we were putting this report together, there is one word that described the experience of so many people that we all talk to, and that is the word invisible. No matter what sector, no matter it's education, corporate America, healthcare, government, whatever, Asian Americans really just felt and feel invisible, right? And so all these about over 50 nationalities make up Asian America, Asian and Asian America, the way we talk about them in the United States. And I think one of the really important things that folks who are watching in East Brunswick and perhaps elsewhere could do is really think about, identifying as Asian American. If we're from, if I'm from India, I'll say I'm Indian American. Somebody will say they're Korean American or Taiwanese. That's your ethnic identity, and absolutely embrace it. But there is so much shared experience with fellow Asian Americans, and it is a legal and social construction. If you're like, well, that doesn't feel right to me. It has to be cultivated to a certain extent sometimes, but there's so much we can do. And we do have shared experience and common cause. So that's why, and in terms of advocating, we want to be able to get folks involved and advocate vis-a-vis education, healthcare. We need disaggregation of data, and looking at issues that most people think aren't affecting Asian Americans, Sylvia, because of what you brought up in terms of being perceived as the model minority.
Thank you so much. Yeah, Jersey Promise is a wonderful group. And for anyone who's interested, the report that Khyati was referring to is available online. You can go ahead and look at it. Yeah, and it tells you about the breakdown of demographics of Asian communities in New Jersey, and really pertinent and rich information. So I wanted to direct the second question to Thomas, and I wanted to ask you a little bit about how your work and your identity intersect. And so as the senior pastor of a very diverse religious community right here in East Brunswick, can you tell us how your identity and experiences as an Asian American have informed your work with your community? How do you define kind of your Asian American-ness in relation to a multi-ethnic community? And just for, kind of a background, Khyati and I are both very interested in the intersections of race and religion. So it's kind of a personal interest of mine to ask you this question as well. So thank you so much.
Well, firstly, thank you, Susanna, for the invitation to join this very distinguished group of panelists. I was looking forward to hearing from both of you and learning from both of you and reading your research as well. But there were a lot of questions that you threw there at me, and
I'll limit to one from now on.
To begin, but
how does your Asian Americanness affect your work or shape how you pastor?
Sure. I think the Asian American experience for us, there are certainly some broad generalities that are common to different ethnic groups, whether Korean, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino. But I think there are also unique differences depending on your immigration experience, why you came to this country, where you landed, whether you had the benefit of growing up with your nuclear family, or like in my case, I came to this country as a war refugee with just my brother and I, separated from my family, and lived here in this country for 5 years before I was reunited with my nuclear family. And the reintegration process was extremely tumultuous and really, really challenging. On the one hand, that was a very negative experience. On the flip side of it was, it gave me an opportunity to work. My American guardian was a great advocate and philanthropist, advocating for a lot of refugees and immigrants that were coming to this country at the time, whether they were Indian or different Southeast Asians, as well as Pakistanis and, from all over the world. And so that gave me an opportunity to have a very rich, culturally diverse experience. And one of the things that I really learned early on was this sense of displacement and disconnect to the larger culture allowed me, through the pain of my experience, to really be able to relate to those that have a very disruptive and harsh transition to this country. And I think pain can go one of two ways. It can either really sensitize you or it can really harden you. And, in my case, it was an opportunity for me to really see a much bigger picture of how the diversity and richness in this country is a real gift, as opposed to, a liability. I think my Asian American experience is different, perhaps, than those that were born in this country. I consider myself a third culture kind of a person, a third culture kid, meaning that, my first culture was Chinese. My second culture is American. So I'm Chinese American, but the reality is that third culture, where I probably feel most comfortable, is where I'm not in that primary homogeneous kind of space. And I think a lot of biculture people and a lot of third culture people find that they're able to navigate those cultural terrains and find a lot more comfort being in a third space, rather than either being in their original immigrant background type of soil or even not fully comfortable in white America, if you will, but in a place where all of us have a shared degree of collective discomfort, if you will. And I feel like that third culture space. So that's kind of what has shaped me as a pastor and as a spiritual leader in my community. One of the things that I try to say to my congregation often, and to my leaders often, is, we want everybody to feel welcomed when they come to our congregation, but I don't want anybody to ever feel 100% comfortable. So you should feel 100% welcomed, but never 100% comfortable, because there should always be enough differences, and we should have enough differences. And in our congregation, we have over 11 different races and ethnicities as a part of our congregation, that, if we are being who we set out to be as a church, there should always be some element of dissonance and discomfort that you experience. And if you aren't feeling that, then you have probably settled for a subculture or a clique or a niche group that you have kind of, distanced yourself away from really what we're trying to do as an overall church.
That's really beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I think in both yours and Khyati's responses, what I hear is that there's this incredible heterogeneity, like difference and diversity within this category of Asian American. But as you say, Khyati, and as you're talking about your congregation, there's also incredible strength and possibility in trying to get to know one another and to find that common thread that connects a community in a certain way that has continually been viewed as an other. Right. And I think that's the thread that we can think about, and that I hope to move into now with the next questions about what's driving this latest iteration of anti-Asian violence. Because here in central New Jersey and Edison and East Brunswick, and we have very large Asian American communities of all backgrounds, and we appear to be very vibrant and thriving. We got our H-Marts, our Rich 99s, we got everything. But as the group Stop AAPI Hate has reported, there were 47 race-based incidents against Asian Americans in New Jersey last year, the 8th most of any state in this country. And we've heard of repeated incidents of violence in New York and across the country. So anti-Asian American sentiment is nothing new. But why now? And we all watch the news and all that, but what do you personally feel in your communities or on a broader level is driving this spike at this moment now? And whoever wants to jump in, go ahead.
Well, actually, and Sylvia, I will answer your question, but I really very much, Pastor Wong, appreciated what you were talking about in terms of, being a third culture kid. I think those of us who study Asian American studies, Sylvia, I think you'd agree that, there's many of us who identify that way, and yet that identifying as a third culture person isn't the same for everybody who identifies third culture. I hope that made sense. So thank you so much. And I very much appreciated you sharing your personal story. I think that to now go back to the question, Sylvia, that you posed, right? There's no question that the previous president gave permission to spew such hate, and then to actually take action on that hate and bias that exists. But it really just uncovered what the bias that's been there, right? So one of the things that I think we have to constantly talk about is that it's not new, it's been there. And when there are times of national uncertainty, when there are times of national insecurity, immigrants get targeted, right? And in this case, because the former president kept saying Wuhan virus, the day he left office, that morning at Joint Air Base Andrews, he still used that friggin' phrase Wuhan virus, right? So definitely all of that. But I think what we have to talk about that doesn't often get mentioned is that everybody hears about this hate and the spewing of this hate, but that the history of Asian Americans in this country and the constant cycle of discrimination that various groups have faced. And even just think about what's happened in the last month. Not only do we have what happened in Atlanta with the murder of 6 women, right? Asian and Asian American women, but then we have potentially the targeting of Sikh Americans in Indianapolis, right? That is also part of needing to say, stop AAPI hate, right? And yet these are conversations we're having right now because folks weren't always talking about the Sikh American community as part of Asian America, even though many of us do talk about it that way, right? So I think the element that is missing that would really make a difference is education, is Asian Americans themselves knowing their own history, as well as the larger community. And I think that that's one of the things that gets not knowing our history gets in the way of not being able to advocate for ourselves, and actually gets in the way of building coalition with other racial minority communities.
Yeah, actually, Khyati, you answered my follow-up question too. So I wanted to, I'll ask only two questions to you, Pastor Wong, but they go together. So again, I thank you so much for that, Khyati. I wanted to ask you again the same question. What do you think is driving this spike? And you can talk about it on a community level as well. And how are you responding, both personally and professionally, to what you're seeing going on?
Sure. You know, the question that I have in the back of my mind as I look at these reports and incidences is what I'm not, 100% certain about is whether there is an actual rise in anti-Asian incidents or whether there's just been a rise in reporting. Because I think there have been some articles that have come out, and some of it even on the AAPI, Stop AAPI Hate Facebook page, that crimes against Asian American minorities are significantly underreported. And if there's one thing that we understand about Asian Americans in general, just the cultural psychology and profile is that, our people group tend to be a lot more deferential. They tend to be a lot more not non-vocal. The stereotypes, to go along with some of the stereotypes that you raised earlier, that, sometimes people have about Asian Americans, we are oftentimes viewed as industrious, disciplined, silent. We go along to get along, and we view education and professionalism as the way to rise above that. And so, for our first generation and second generation immigrants who came here to this country, not knowing the culture, not knowing the recourse that they have, the legal recourse or the rights that they have in this country, just simply learn, keep your head down, don't make waves, don't talk back, don't complain, don't vocalize your anger and your concern. And I think that becomes a part of our cultural fabric that is difficult to unlearn. I think that is why there is probably a significant amount of underreporting. And I think what has happened particularly in the last year since March, is seeing the number of racial injustices and atrocities that have been committed in our country in different ways. I've seen as never before a rise even in the Asian American community to stand up and to begin to vocalize our anger about the kind of treatment that people of color and minorities have experienced in ways that I've never seen before. And even for my own self, have found that, I have participated in rallies and sometimes with my family in ways that we have never before. And I think that for the first time, Asian Americans in this country, because they have participated in vocalizing their anger over the injustices that they've seen in our culture at large, are beginning to find their own voice, and they're beginning to use their voice in ways that our parents and the first and second generation never have, Either because they were just culturally illiterate, they didn't know how to navigate the cultural terrain. B, partly because they didn't speak the language well. And thirdly, simply because of the cultural profile of keeping our head down and working hard, and that's the way to succeed. I think as second and third generations have become more and more Americanized and mainstreamed, if you will, we realize the opportunity that we have to not only speak our own voices, but to actually even speak on behalf of those that are unable to speak because they don't have the tools culturally or maybe even linguistically, or they can't because their lives have been snuffed out. And so I think we are beginning to realize that we not only have the ability and the opportunity, but even the responsibility to speak for those who aren't able to speak for themselves or those who can no longer speak for themselves.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, please.
No, I was just thinking as you were speaking that you bring up yet another aspect of the diversity and multiplicity of Asian American communities, which are generational differences. And so much of, I think, Asian American, whatever that category encompasses, the many identities that category encompasses, is the ways in which different Asian Americans have different relationships with America. So for example, if you're an immigrant who's newly arrived and you are hoping to build your life here, you are much more likely to keep your head down and kind of like, I don't want to involve myself in that. I just want to work. Whereas the children, the second generation, the third generation, who are of here and have never lived in other places or don't have memories, are going to be very invested in trying to find their identity as someone who is growing up in America. And so you have these generational differences, I think, really speaking to the ways, like you said, Asian American communities are speaking up, responding to these types of incidents in new ways. So while the violence might be, kind of another iteration of historical events, perhaps the responses are shifting. And so with that, I wanted to ask you, in your work, Khyati as an advocate and educator, and Pastor Wong, in your congregation, what have you found to be effective ways to talk to your communities, and in particular Asian American communities, about issues of race and racism? And what challenges have you faced? So what has been effective, and what are the challenges that you find in doing this work with Asian American communities?
I would say that the one thing that the communities I'm involved with here in Jersey, as well as elsewhere, I'm from Atlanta, that's home for me, is since what happened to George Floyd on May 27th, we are, folks are thankfully having more conversations about the anti-Blackness that exists in our own communities. Whether, it's the way that in Gujarati and in Hindi and what, people talk about Black people. It is also issues of colorism, the way we talk about folks who are darker versus lighter. These conversations, which really didn't happen that much before, which should have, long time ago, but I think that they've been happening more, and religious groups are, talking about them in ways that we haven't. So that's been, it's kind of, it's difficult because I'm so happy that those conversations are happening. And then part of me is also like, where you been? Where you been? I was at a Black Lives Matter rally here in Wayne, which I never thought I'd see that happen, but it did. And I was so amazed when I looked around and I saw some aunties there in their salwar kameez, and I was like, wow. Okay, like we are in definitely a moment when it comes to these certain communities, but constant conversation, about this, because it is with increasing awareness in our communities that we're going to get people building friendships and bonds across communities, right? And that's what we need, and that's what the second and subsequent generations are able to do, while immigrants are focused more on themselves. And we know that's been what's often happened. Asian Americans are not unique in that way. I also, what I'll say is I work with schools and school districts, and I've been doing stuff that we would call, Sylvia, Asian American Studies for a long time with the schools. It's just, I never called it that, and more is being done. But that's what we really need to do. I was with Governor Murphy last week, and I said, the way that we have the Amistad Commission, the way that we've made teaching gay and lesbian history mandatory, for example, in middle school, the way that we have environmental justice curriculum, we need Asian American studies in K through 12. So that's my sphere of influence, and I'm going full on, and we all have to kind of work together to make it happen, but I think we can.
I don't work in the academic field in a way that you and Dr. Joshi do. And,
that's good.
We are so happy to listen to you.
My sphere is a little bit more limited, but, my thought in response to that is, I think you can live in a diverse community without becoming personally diversified, without becoming culturally sensitized, and without becoming racially and ethnically conversant and appreciative. I think it's one thing to respect other races and ethnicities. It's another thing to appreciate those differences. I think respecting other people's differences is like, hey, you do you, I'll do me. And as long as we don't step on each other's turf, we can, live and let live. That's respect. And to me, it falls a dimension short of what we really want to experience in our collective human experience. I think what we're strive for, and I think what we really desire as human beings, and what I encourage my congregation is not only just simply tolerate or respect other people's differences, whether they be social, political, even philosophical and spiritual and social, economic, but don't just respect, but appreciate. You have to learn to be able to understand those differences and come to appreciate those differences. We don't just welcome you in our midst, but we are actually glad that you bring something different to the table. You bring something different to our experience. It broadens and enriches my perspective of life and the world in which I live. It helps me to be a better human being, actually. And that's what we really strive for. I think the challenge to that is we know that there's a level of ethnocentrism that operates within every people group, right? So there's always a natural inclination and comfort that we find in being with people that are like ourselves, whether they are shared affinities. And obviously race and ethnicity is a large gravity that pulls, you towards other people that are like you. And therefore, I think the great challenge in actually being able to develop that kind of appreciation for the other is really being able to recognize and identify the kind of ethnocentrism that is at work in your own self, very subtly, oftentimes unrecognizable, but it leads you to, doing things with people that are just like you. And, I talk with a lot of my collegians and young adults over the years, and I ask them the question, when you look at your social media, your Instagram, your Facebook, and so on, what would you see? Would you see a diverse population of people that you actually do life with and intersect with? Or are you mostly just with people that are just like you? And I think this is true for most people, not just Asians, but I think this is true for most folks, is that we generally tend, birds of a feather flock together. And I think that's the greatest challenge, is being able to cultivate a community kind of a space where we don't just respect the differences in our larger community and maybe even in our religious community, but we actually come to a place where we can appreciate and recognize how much richer and necessary is the experience that you bring to me and that I bring to you. that these are actually vital. I think that's the greatest challenge. That's what we try to do as a church.
Yeah, no, that's really wonderful. And again, I see this thread in both of your responses in which, you know, in a way, it sounds like what you're saying, the effective way to talk about race is to actually talk about race. Like just to talk about it. Let's not just pretend, oh, we're all the same. We're different. We have different backgrounds. We have different languages. We have different foods. We have different histories. And we have to talk about them. But, and so it's interesting that we're in a religious context with some grace for one another.
Yes.
You know, with listening, with grace. And in these instances of anti-Asian violence where communities are feeling scared, you know, we really have to give each other that space to feel the fear and to talk through it and to extend that grace, I think. But we have to talk about it. And I think that is what I hear in what you're saying.
Yeah.
That in schools, in your congregations, it's a hard conversation, but utterly necessary.
It is. And I think that where that division between respect and appreciation really is demonstrated is when you look at the religious landscape across our country. I believe it was Martin Luther King Jr. who said that 11 a.m. is still the most segregated hour in America.
Yep.
And so simply, you know, faith in and of itself doesn't naturally build the kind of bridges that we think it should. It requires more intentionality, and which is what I'm suggesting is that we don't simply respect the differences, you know, in our community and amongst one another, but we actually learn to appreciate it.
Yeah, great, thank you. So I think I have 5 minutes, and so the last question I'd like to ask is, you know, the practical question. What suggestions, the mayor is here, school board member is here, what practical suggestions would you offer communities like East Brunswick and all across New Jersey to address these issues of anti-Asian violence and racism more broadly at the level of the community and local leadership?
Well,
I just,
go ahead.
yeah, I was just going to say, I would just start by, you know, my takeaway from a lot of the comments here is talking about it. And that's what we're doing here, is that's a start, right? And engaging and broadening that net and engaging more people into the discussion. And,
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so over time. But go ahead. I'm so sorry. Go ahead, Susanna.
No, that's okay. Okay, I think that was an important question. So I do want to go around the room and hear the feedback from the other panelists.
Oh, well, I'll just quickly say a couple things. Number one, I find it's very helpful, and with my students and the groups I work with, to try to talk about racisms, right? Because different racial minorities experience racism differently. And I think one of the reasons, we know this from data, actually, it's not about just thinking, many Asian Americans who actually experience what most of us would identify as racism or racial discrimination, when asked about it, many of them will say, no, it's not a big deal. You know, if they're asked, have you experienced any racism? Many will say no. And then when they actually go on to tell you something and an experience they had, it is absolutely racism, right? But what has happened, and even today, racism often gets defined and described and discussed vis-a-vis the Black-white paradigm. And so the talking, Susanna, that you were getting at is so important. People being able to name their pain, identify their pain, and then you also actually, others, when we reveal our vulnerabilities like that, many people will step in. I think there is this sense, especially with immigrant groups and with specifically within Asian America, is that, you know, you keep your chin up, you don't complain, right? And you just keep trying to move ahead. And that's not working. And our communities need to be able to have some affinity group space to come together and to talk about their experiences.
Pastor Wong, do you have like a few practical suggestion or two that you would like to share?
Boy, yeah, I don't know. You know, I think this is a great start. This is the listening part. I think listening, learning, and then acting in that order. I think a rush to acting without actually listening is just as futile as listening without acting. And I think what often happens in these kinds of racial conversations is a rush to either spouting data or being defensive or justifying or excusing or finding ways to say, this is really not the issue, kind of like what Dr. Joshi just said. We learn how to deflect and dismiss things as not necessarily being racial. They were just, ignorance, or that was unintended. But I think actually finding ways to listen to individuals in the community so that we have first-handed accounts and experience of those who have experienced these kinds of prejudices and racism, learning their experience, learning their pain, learning their story. And then from that, we're able to actually develop strategies and actions that make sense. I think it has to be in that order. We have to listen, we have to learn, then we can act.
That's a great note to end on, to listen, learn, and act. So thank you so much to Pastor Thomas Wong and Dr. Kiati Joshi for sharing your thoughts. It was really fun and enlightening. And thank you to Susanna and Mayor Cohen for creating the space. So
yeah, thank
back
you.
Over to you.
Thank you to all of you. Now, speaking of listening, now that we've heard from our experts, educators, community leaders, let's hear from our younger generation. What are their concerns, their hopes, and their dreams for the future?
Hello, my name is Eunice Kim. I am a senior at East Brunswick High School, as well as the current president of Asian Club. Oftentimes in the past, when it came to talks of adult things, children and teenagers were pushed away. However, during this era of change, where more and more members of the youth are leading movements across the globe, it is important that we continue to include youth in these conversations. We hope that by participating in this event run by the East Brunswick Human Relations Council, that we will be able to encourage more discussion and furthermore be able to open the minds of everyone in our community. We also hope that by partaking in more conversations as members of the younger generation, that we will be able to build bridges across generations, across race, and across cultures. Thank you.
I am not a virus.
We belong here too.
This is our home too.
I am not a virus.
I will help build bridges by choosing to educate people about what is going on.
I will help build bridges by continuing to have open and honest dialogue of shared experiences across marginalized groups so that we can better understand how to advocate for one another.
I will help build bridges by continuing my allyship and continuing to also educate people.
Build bridges by uplifting the minority voices to bring empowerment, visibility, and justice for all people alike.
I will help to build bridges by promoting conversations that highlight Asian American voices to draw attention to and educate others about their experiences.
The efforts of hearing from the young voices in our community is one step towards building this bridge, but it's important to continue this dialogue today, tomorrow, and into the future.
All right, thank you. What a powerful, powerful message from our youth. We certainly have reason for optimism when we hear from the voices of our future leaders. Our goal tonight was to broaden our perspectives and to whet your appetite to learn more. We'll be posting resources through Facebook after this event. I also want to point out that in lieu of any honorariums for our speakers, there will be a donation made to stopaapihate.org aimed at tracking and responding to incidents of hate, violence, harassment, and discrimination of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States. On behalf of the Human Relations Council and the East Brunswick Public Library, I want to thank our moderator, Dr. Chan-Malik, and our panelists, Dr. Joshi and Pastor Wong, for sharing their insights and experiences with us. In addition, I want to recognize Mayor Brad Cohen for his support for the EBHRC, our talented team at EBTV for their work behind the scenes, our event committee, which included myself along with Holly Sarami, Christina Chu, Lou Figueroa, Paula Quinton, and Frank Shen. And of course, our youth community, including the EBHS Asian Club, our student members of the EBHRC, and others for sharing their perspectives with us tonight. Please follow us on Facebook so that we can continue our dialogue. Our next Facebook Live event will be on Tuesday, May 11th to discuss the topic of ageism. I look forward to seeing you there. Thank you for joining us this evening, and good night.